In today's writer's review, we'll be checking out Project Hail Mary, the newest novel by the New York Times bestselling author Andy Weir. In this video, I hope to give you a spoiler-free look at this novel, as well as a bit of a comparison between Project Hail Mary and The Martian, seeing as how the two books are quite similar. And I'm also guessing that a lot of you out there might be interested in such a comparison. On my left is a breakdown of today's episode in case you want to skip ahead, and you can find the same timestamps in the scroll bar down below. I hope you enjoyed this review. Now let's get on to the video. One of the first things you'll notice after picking up Project Hail Mary is that this is primarily a single character focused novel. In this regard, I'd even go as far to say that Project Hail Mary manages to outdo The Martian. For instance, if you've read The Martian, I'm sure you can remember how parts of that novel were dedicated to switching the perspective away from Mark Watney to some of the other supporting characters, like the various NASA managers on Earth or some of Watney's crew members on the Hermes. But with Project Hail Mary, you'll find that it strictly adheres to its single point of view character formula throughout its full length. In accordance to that, the total number of characters in Project Hail Mary is rather small, perhaps even half that of The Martian, and in my opinion, this is one of the few artistic choices of the book which slightly subtract from the overall reading experience. In terms of narration style, the novel is written in first-person past tense prose, and additionally, the overall structure of the novel is split into two distinct main storylines, one in the present and one in the past. Now, in practice, this means that the novel features quite a number of flashback sequences throughout its entire length, numbering between 10 and 20 by my best count, so you can expect a lot of jumping back and forth between the two storylines throughout your read-through. Now, personally, I found this a bit distracting at the very beginning of the book, where the frequency of this jumping back and forth is quite high, but later on in the novel, this frequency drops by a significant amount, so I didn't find it bothersome anymore. From Project Hail Mary's title and cover art, it's pretty apparent that the overall premise of the novel is some sort of space-themed last-ditch mission, and I don't think it takes a scientist to guess that that mission is saving humanity from extinction. Now, as to why exactly humanity is facing extinction and how our protagonists are planning to fix the problem, I won't go into, since that would be sailing too far into spoiler territory, but let's just say that whatever their exact mission is, it involves a lot of science stuff and, in the moment, creative problem solving, which I'm betting, if you've already read The Martian, is ringing a lot of bells. At the same time, though, Project Hail Mary's story includes far more adventure, exploration, and discovery themes than were present with The Martian. So where with that novel, Watney usually already knew of, or at least had direct access to information about problems he faced, tools he had on hand, or places he had to travel to, Project Hail Mary's protagonist more often than not finds himself facing challenges completely out of his comfort zone, and consequently has to develop plans and solutions completely from scratch, or at worst, first has to MacGyver methods to even figure out the exact nature of problems he's facing. Next, moving on to the novel subgenre composition, you'll find that Project Hail Mary's most predominant subgenre element is its drama, as most of the story's story beats are presented through some sort of dialogue between characters or via monologue. Because of this, a huge factor into whether you enjoy this novel will come down to whether you enjoy this book's protagonist and his personality, especially since almost a third of the book consists of the protagonist being completely isolated and essentially talking to himself about various things, but more on him later on in my final thoughts on the book. The second largest subgenre building block of Project Hail Mary would be the combination of world building and historic elements. This consists of the various scientific discoveries the protagonist encounters throughout the entire length of the novel, as well as the innovative science-based solutions he finds to the problems he encounters. And since a lot of the modern science Weir incorporates into the story is based on the achievements of previous generations, it's natural that there are also a lot of historic references spread throughout the novel. Somewhat connected to these last two, the novel also features a handful of philosophical elements, and these are for the most part connected to the origins of life on our planet, but of course explored through the context of this novel's fictional version of events on our humble green marble. And after that, the novel also explores interesting questions like what means justify what ends, as well as the moral question of when the needs of the many outweigh the needs of individuals. After that, the rest of the novel's subgenre elements come up in very limited capacity. The first example of these would be the action elements, which consist of only a handful of sequences where the protagonist takes on the role of NASA's version of Indiana Jones. Then we have the romance elements, but these only apply to a pair of side characters in the novel. Then we have a smattering of psychological elements, and these for the most part deal with the ramifications of the isolation our protagonist goes through on his voyage, as well as the psychological aspects of someone with extreme memory loss being tasked with a mission that carries enormous pressure and responsibility. And lastly, the novel also features some comedic aspects, but nowhere near as many as there were present with The Martian. Truth be told, this is something I really missed throughout my read-through of Project Hail Mary, but at the same time I can also understand that Weir might have just been trying to dial back on the comedy to make Project Hail Mary feel less like The Martian. In terms of the book's other quirks, I'd say that its most identifying feature are its educational aspects and how it tries to promote science in general. Throughout my reading experience, it was clear that Andy Weir really tried to communicate that science isn't some sort of black magic performed by scientists behind closed doors, but rather a fun and interesting process of trial, educated guesswork, and error to achieve a given goal. While with The Martian, his focus might have been more on the engineering and problem-solving side of science, with Project Hail Mary, Andy Weir decided to delve more into the field of biology and the research side of the profession. And in my opinion, he really nailed the description of both of these throughout the entire length of the novel. Although that being said, I do believe I might have caught a couple of inaccuracies throughout the novel, which I'll be covering more in depth in my discussion video on Project Hail Mary. So if that's something that interests you, consider coming back in a week or two when that video goes live, or better yet, consider subscribing to the channel to be notified when the video goes live, since I'm admittedly not the best at sticking to my own upload schedule. So in the end, what do I think about Project Hail Mary? Well, it's definitely a good book, and I think it would be hard to argue against that, but at the same time I wouldn't categorize it as one of the best books I've ever read. I really enjoyed the overall theme of Project Hail Mary's story and its scientific aspects. I've been a lover of biology my whole life, and I found it especially fun to spot tidbits of biochemistry, genetics, and general biology trivia which I had previously learned during the course of my studies at university. I also really enjoyed the overall positive outlook of Weir's writing, specifically how despite having set the story in an apocalyptic setting, he still chose to focus on how humanity can step together in times of great hardship instead of squabbling amongst each other for petty reasons. But I will say that I was quite let down by the novel's overall cast of characters. The protagonist, for instance, I personally found a bit bland and forgettable, which really drags the book down in my opinion, since vast sections of the novel are purely dedicated to him. Additionally, the cast of supporting characters is tiny, and while these are for the most part way more dynamic than our protagonist, they get almost no screen time, so I often felt disappointed that they didn't get explored more. The novel does improve in this regard in the second half somewhat, with the introduction of the second main character, who has way more of an energetic personality and is in general way more interesting to learn about, but that still doesn't make up fully for the first blander half of the novel. But at the end of the day, I also realize that this is largely a subjective issue, so maybe you'll end up enjoying the protagonist way more than I did. As for whether I'd recommend you pick up Project Hail Mary, I'd say it really comes down to what you're looking to get from the novel. If you're someone who enjoys science fiction books for their science aspects, then definitely pick up the novel, as it's even better, more detailed and more ambitious than the Martian was. If, however, you aren't such a science geek, and for instance enjoyed the Martian more for Watney's wit and charm, then maybe Project Hail Mary isn't the best fit for you. But as always, that's just my opinion, and in the end it comes down to you whether you decide to pick up the novel or not. But in case it helps out, I'll also put up the novel's usual ratings up on screen for you now. Project Hail Mary is available in ebook, paperback, hardcover and audiobook formats, and it clocks in at a length of 16 hours or 170,000 words for the written versions. In terms of pricing, the cheapest version of Project Hail Mary is surprisingly the hardcover copy at $13, followed by the ebook at $15, and lastly the paperback at a whopping $35. If you're an audiobook listener, you might want to know that there is a WhisperSync deal available, so you can get the audiobook for a reduced price of just under $8 if you buy it alongside the ebook. Otherwise, you're just better off using an Audible credit to make your purchase. Of course, pricing might have changed by the time you're watching this video, so I'll have a handy Amazon link in the description down below. And that about wraps up the spoiler-free section of this review. If you enjoyed this type of spoiler-free, in-depth review, I'd be thrilled if you subscribe to the channel, but if that's too big of a commitment, I'd welcome you to check out my last review of The Final Empire in the top right corner of your screen, which is one of my favorite fantasy books. Thank you for joining me on this review, and now let's move on to the writing-oriented lesson section, so spoiler warning ahead. So in my conclusions, I mentioned that I found Project Hail Mary's protagonist a bit underwhelming, and that he's one of the main downsides of the novel as a whole. So naturally, I'll be using this section of the video to go more into detail as to why exactly I found Rayland Grace to be a bit lacking from my perspective as an amateur writer, and what exactly I would do to improve him. Now, this mostly boils down to two issues I have, one being his personality, and the second being his motivations and how they play out throughout the whole novel. Let's start out by taking a look at Ryland's personality and overall character arc. Specifically, how he doesn't really change all that much by the end of the novel. For the sake of this example, I'll be focusing on Ryland's mental toughness when faced with social pressure. For those of you who haven't read the novel, we first encounter Ryland Grace when he wakes up on a spaceship in a completely different star system, and through the first couple of flashback sequences, we learn that he's a disgraced researcher who got shunned from the scientific community over a paper he wrote. Specifically, due to the backlash he received over that paper, he chose to abandon his research career and settled for being a high school science teacher, which in my mind kind of established him as a pushover character. Later, when the sun started dimming, he got drafted into the Hail Mary project because of that very paper, became an integral part in the research process of how the star-eating bacteria functioned, and lastly was handed the position of science project manager for the Hail Mary project, where he personally oversaw the design and construction of the spaceship that would go into deep space in search of a solution to humanity's extinction problem. But at the same time, Ryland managed not to realize that he held such an important position in the project, a fact that is even mentioned several times throughout the novel. Then, near the end of the novel, we learn that Ryland wasn't even supposed to be one of the crew members on the ship he now finds himself on, and was rather drugged and forced to be a part of the crew against his will after the two main choices for the scientist crew member role died in an accident. Furthermore, in that exact flashback sequence, we learn that Ryland was actually too scared to volunteer for this suicide mission, and that the person who decided to force him on the mission did so believing that after Ryland woke up at the destination, he wouldn't have the balls to sabotage the mission. And in that moment where Ryland remembers all of this, he even admits to himself that he's too soft of a person to take any kind of revenge and just goes on with the mission as if nothing had happened. And in my mind, in doing so, just confirms and further solidifies what kind of a pushover he is. If you look at Ryland as a character, you can spot this same lack of personal development in other aspects of his personality. For instance, the ingenuity he shows at the end of the book is no different than that he shows at the start. The compassion he shows by helping his alien friend Rocky is no different from the care he displays towards his students at the beginning of the book, and his overall curiosity is the same from the first page of the novel to the last. And in my opinion, all of this combined makes him way less of an interesting character than he could have been. For instance, in the example I gave before, I would have found it way more interesting if Grace would have lost his mind after figuring out how he had been betrayed, and even gone as far as deciding to sabotage the mission, let's say under the logic that a species that does something so horrible to one of its members isn't worth saving. Then, only after he had done significant damage to the spaceship, his compassion could win over again, and he'd get back to the mission at hand. This would both serve as a moment of personal growth for Ryland, where he would resolve why he let people walk all over him all his life, as well as a moment that could really highlight the capabilities for compassion he had, perhaps even more than he ever thought possible. Plus, the damage he caused could be an interesting setback that he would have to deal with. And now moving on to the second thing that I've found bothersome about Rayland Grace, his motivations. Personally, I found them to be a bit weak from the very beginning of the book, and at the very least they didn't really come full circle by the last page of the novel. What I mean by this is that Grace only really joins the Hail Mary project after he realizes that if nothing is done about the star-eating bacteria problem, that all of his high school students will die. We even get a really heartfelt moment where Grace is talking to his students in the classroom and he imagines what kinds of horrific lives these children would go through. The author even goes as far as to naming the individual children to really give this impression of a personal connection between Grace and his students. But after these first few mentions, the students get almost completely dropped and are practically never again mentioned in a meaningful way. And that's all the way up to the end of the novel, where Ryland has already found the solution to the star-eating bacteria problem in the Tau-Setti system, sent drones to deliver information back to Earth, and helped his alien friend Rocky by giving him a ride back to his homeworld. I mean, this was literally Ryland's main motivation for joining the Hail Mary project in the first place, so it's kinda strange that this motivation goes unresolved by the end of the book. Sure, we do see Grace being a high school teacher again on Rocky's homeworld in the epilogue for a couple of paragraphs, but again, Grace didn't go through all of this hassle to save humanity just so he could become a high school teacher again someday, but instead to save the lives of his students. Not just any students, but his students, the ones that were mentioned by name at the very beginning of the book. I do understand that with that ending to the novel, Weir was probably trying to keep a sense of mystery around Earth's final fate, because admittedly sometimes it's best to let your readers imagine what kind of outcome they want most. But a short scene of Grace's students having a class reunion to honor their teacher's awesomeness and heroicism would have gone a long way to show that Grace's trials in the Tau-Setti system were worth it at the end, without going too far into detail about Earth's overall fate. And that's about all I had to say for this review. As I mentioned before, I will be uploading a discussion video on this novel in a week or two, hopefully, so definitely stay tuned for that, and maybe even leave a comment if there's something special you'd like me to cover in that video. Remember to leave a like on this video and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video, and I hope to see you next time.